Hi everyone, and thank you for joining another Apex Private Wealth webinar. These presentations aim to provide you, the end investor, with more insight into the investment world by giving you direct access to some of the industry's leading professionals. We would like to keep these sessions as informative as possible. If you have any topical ideas or thoughts, please feel free to reach out. From a business perspective, the last few months have been extremely busy for us, specifically around trusts. Following our grey listing earlier this year, both SARS and the Master's Office have taken active steps towards monitoring and administering trusts and rightly so. In the past, trust admin was something that was just done in the background. Some trustees did this, while others chose not to, with really no real consequence. However, going forward, once the trust files its annual tax return, SARS will request numerous documentation from the trustees. Examples of these documents are copies of the annual financial statements, minutes of the trustee AGM, ultimate beneficial ownership requirements, copies of the trust deed, and details of named beneficiaries, to name a few. This is something that we welcome at Apex, as we've been keeping records of all such requirements for many years regarding trusts we manage. If you would like assistance or direction regarding a trust that you have, please reach out to us. On to some housekeeping, which I'm sure you're all familiar with, seeing as though Zoom has become such a big part of our lives. If at any time during the presentation you lose connectivity or the video freezes, please simply leave the webinar, rejoin using the same link which was sent to you upon registration. There will be some time for question and answers at the end. Please feel free to type in any questions you may have in the Q&A feature at the bottom of the page. A recording will also be made available in the next few days. I now hand over to my colleague Renee, who will introduce Clem Sunter. Thank you.
Thanks, Brendan. So what we thought we would do to introduce the webinar is we're going to have a poll. And the poll, the intention around that is to have a couple of things that will then lead into the discussion with Clem. And then we've got a little cheeky third poll there just around the Rugby World Cup. So we're just going to give you a few moments to answer the questions, and then I'll head into introducing Clem. A bit of background on Clem. Clem was the chairman and the CEO of the Gold and Uranium divisions of Anglo-American at the time when it was one of the biggest producers of gold in the world. Also chairman of the Anglo-American Chairman's Fund. And from that, Clem morphed into being a futurologist as well as a scenario planner and the author of multiple books. What many don't know is that Clem had a very important role in the late 1980s in steering our nation towards the high road of negotiation rather than what we saw as a widely anticipated civil war. So when we look at South Africa at present, we're faced again with what could be deemed another watershed moment, particularly around the elections next year. During today's discussion, Clem's going to take us through some of those key flags that are shaping our transition from present to the future, the positive and negative scenarios that could potentially emerge from this, and then offering some probabilities based on that current evidence. So after that intro, Clem, if we can hand over to you.
Thanks so much. And I really am pleased to be talking for Apex Private Wealth, who've managed my living and retirement annuities for a long time and done it extremely well. So I hope that I can interest all of you who are listening to me today in this presentation. I want to do three things. I want to go through the methodology which I now use together with Chantal Aubry and her son Mitch to look at the future. It really dates back to the 1980s when, as was said in my introduction, we were doing the high road and low road scenarios for South Africa. Then I'd like to move on to the global flags and scenarios, and then talk about South Africa. Well, in the 1980s, we had this incredible consultant who helped us write the high road, low road scenarios. He was from Royal Dutch Shell. He'd been head of their scenario planning team during the 1980s. And he in the 70s. And he had actually captured both oil price shocks. The first one in the early 70s when it went from $3 to $12 a barrel. And the second one when it went from $12 to about $40 a barrel in the late 70s. He captured them in scenarios and showed that it was a much better approach to looking at the future when there were surprises in the future than trying to forecast what was going to happen. And Pierre's reputation spread around London, and he came to work for us as a consultant in South Africa in the early 1980s. And I always remember two things he said about looking at the future. He said, firstly, you've got to look at the forces that are driving the present into the future. In other words, don't make huge leaps into the future. Look around you to see what are the forces that are changing the game as we speak. And he divided them into predetermined elements, which he meant forces that have fairly precise conclusions to them. The other one was variables, where you have a force where it can go in several different directions. He then combined the predetermined elements with the variables and came up with different scenarios that could come out of these particular forces. And what I've done is change his words from predetermined elements to flags, and I call them the clockwork flags, the ones that are ticking away with fairly precise conclusions, and then the cloudy flags, which are the variables which can really push the future in one or other direction. For example, I'm going to talk today about the aging of the global population. That's a clockwork flag because it's ticking away and it's changing the world as we speak. And then the war in Ukraine is a very cloudy flag because who knows how that particular flag is going to play out, but it's very important at the moment in influencing the economic gain, particularly in Europe. So that's the first thing is, look at the flags. And obviously you can be more specific in terms of looking at the flags, changing your own game. So it could be the investment game, it could be the banking game, whatever industry a company is in, they will look at those particular forces which are changing their industry. Let me give you an example. I did a session with a major bank in the early part of the century, and one of the flags that they produced was that the mobile device would change the whole role of a banking branch. And it has, because now most people do their everyday banking on a mobile device, as opposed to going in and getting cash or whatever at a particular branch. And that's why in the UK at the moment you're seeing so many branches of banks closing down, because the game's changed. But you could if you were a good futurist in the early part of the century, predict that actually was going to happen, because it was very much a clockwork flag. After you've defined the flags, you have to say, what are the scenarios? Pierre used to say to me, it's much better to be vaguely right than precisely wrong. And there's a lot of truth in that. It's better to cover the different possibilities that can happen in the future, rather than making a very precise strategic forecast. And then obviously, given the status of the flags, you can then give probabilities to the different scenarios. And it's just a much better way of handling the future. So Pierre Wack, Frenchman, who headed up Shell, really is the guy who was the force behind our model. We then, in the late 1990s, I wrote a book called Never Mind the Millennium, What About the Next 24 Hours? And in that, I used the metaphor of the fox and the hedgehog. There was an ancient Greek poet called Archilochus who said, the hedgehog knows one big thing, whereas the fox knows many little things. And I thought this was a very good way of contrasting the scenario planner who looks around like a fox and looks at all the different flags and scenarios compared to a hedgehog who looks just at the one big forecast looking ahead. And so I adopted that metaphor, which then led to a book which I wrote with Chantal Ilbery in 2001 called The Mind of a Fox, which amplified the whole description of how you could think like a fox when looking at the future. And indeed, there was a philosopher when I was at Oxford in the 1960s called Isaiah Berlin, who wrote a book called The Hedgehog and the Fox. And he was really defining all the authors and politicians in the world into being hedgehogs and foxes. So he wasn't talking about the future. I guess I was the first person to take this metaphor and apply it to futurism. And one of the things that I'm very proud of is that America's top futurist, a guy called Philip Tetlock, wrote a book in the early part of the century called Super Forecasting, which is still, I think, the #1 selling book on how to be a good futurist in America. And he talks of the hedgehog and the fox, and he says foxes are much better at handling the future than hedgehogs. He still talks about forecasting and saying you put a probability on a forecast, which I don't agree with. I think we should play different scenarios, but he did use the hedgehog fox analogy and came to the same conclusion, that it's much smarter to think like a fox. And I'd like to give an example. In that book, The Mind of a Fox, which was published in June 2001, we wrote a letter to George Bush in which we said that he would leave a legacy as president of America if he thought like a fox. And we said in the letter that his biggest threat at the time was a massive terrorist strike on a Western city, which could turn his presidency upside down, and he would have to adapt very quickly to it, like a fox. And it happened 3 months after we published the book with 9/11. And 6 months later, I got a telephone call from the US State Department saying, we've just done a literature search, Mr. Sunter, and we found that yours is the only book written in the world in a direct letter to the president that said, this is your biggest threat. How come? So I felt quite uncomfortable being a person of interest to the US State Department. And I said, we actually use this methodology where we look at the scenarios and then we identify the flags. And we had 3 flags, which made us feel that this was the most telling threat to the US when we wrote that letter. The first flag was the growing competition between the major religions of the world, which began in the late 1980s, particularly between Islam and Christianity and Judaism, and really intensified during the 1990s. The second flag was the growing sophistication of terrorist movements in their strategy and tactics during the 1990s. But the third flag was very specific. It was the 2 attacks by Al-Qaeda on American embassies in Africa, one in Tanzania and the other in Kenya in 1998, which we felt could be a prelude to an attack on the West. And interestingly, it came out in the congressional inquiry after 9/11 that there was a young woman in the FBI who went to her boss on 6 occasions and said, boss, there's a flying school down the road where 2 Arabs are learning to take off and not land. It was completely ignored by her boss. But that was a very specific flag because both those pilots ended up amongst the 19 who took part in the 9/11 strike. And if only they'd followed up on her flag, they might have actually closed the whole operation down. So we couldn't have had our methodology justified in a more dramatic fashion than that. And overnight, we became quite big stars in America. Our website, mindofafox.com, went to #1 according to Google on the sort of strategic websites in America. And ever since then, we've actually been working for quite a few American companies, as well as companies elsewhere. The other very good example comes from the other side of the globe. In 2006, the Chinese Communist Party asked me to give a presentation in Beijing at a place called the Central Party School. It's their leadership academy, and they developed the 5-year economic plans at the school. And they wanted to see how scenario planning could be used to road test those 5-year economic plans. And so they asked me to give a lecture at the school. And I always remember sitting in this classroom with all these very learned people, talking to them about the methodology. At the end of which I said, let's do a real situation. What is the thing that concerns you the most at the moment? And they said, well, Mr. Sunter, it's American bonds, because we hold $1.75 trillion worth of American bonds, and we're just a little bit worried that they could lose value. And so we actually wrote an American recession scenario, not a crash, I hasten to add, but an American recession scenario. And then I said, what do you think the flags are that would indicate that the scenario is coming into play? And they went into a huddle. And they came back and they said, there's just one flag that we think would indicate that this is about to happen. And that is property prices. Because they said the principal asset of an American consumer is his or her house. And if that declines in value, they'll stop spending so much. And since consumer spending is 2/3 of the American economy, that could turn the economy down. Well, there's an index called the Case-Shiller Index, which measures property prices in America. And they said, we're gonna watch that. And in the last quarter of 2006, I remember having a bit of correspondence with them because for the first time in 20 years, the Case-Shiller Index leveled out in that quarter. And then at the beginning of 2007, it started falling. And by April 2007, the guys at the Central Party School who were in charge of looking at scenarios were giving an 80% probability to an American recession. And of course, it all happened from September 2007 onwards, and it wasn't obviously a recession, it was a crash. But nevertheless, it was incredibly good that they had identified that particular flag. And it's one that I'm still watching right now to see, how house prices are doing in Europe and America and elsewhere, because of course there's been a huge change in mortgage rates over the last 12 months. And this has affected property prices. And the question is whether that is going to feed through to yet another crash. Obviously, it may not be around subprime mortgages. It may be around something else. But one's got to keep that flag in mind. So what are the flags, the global flags that our international clients have come up with over the last 10 to 15 years? And I'd like to go through 11 of them with you, and then give you a couple of scenarios to think about. The first flag is the religious flag. It's still there, the 9/11 flag. It's obviously not as important a flag as it was just after 9/11, because there were some other major incidents, including the 7/7 incident in London a few years later. The threat is still there. And obviously, one's got to watch very carefully the relationship between Iran and Israel and America, because both America and Israel have said that Iran must never fully develop a nuclear weapon. But of course, Iran has been increasing its stocks of weapons made uranium. So it's a clash that could still happen. It's obviously a good thing that Iran seems to be getting back into the world. It's certainly improved its relationship with Saudi Arabia. It's becoming a member of BRICS. But nevertheless, one has to watch that particular flag in the Middle East. The second flag that people talk about a lot is the leadership flag, because whether we like it or not, we're a species where you tend to have one person who can influence the whole world. I mean, let me give you an example. My father was working in London during the 1930s. He was working his way up a particular institution. And suddenly in 1939, his life was totally disrupted because he was called up to serve in the British Army, which he had to do till 1945. And that's because there was a leader elsewhere in the world, in Germany, called Adolf Hitler. And yeah, it changed the lives of millions of people around the world. But of course, the leadership flag can be positive. At the end of the 1980s, you had 3 leaders in the world who really got along with one another. You had Maggie Thatcher in the UK. You had Mikhail Gorbachev in Russia, and you had Ronald Reagan in America. And they got along with one another to the extent that the Cold War ended at that time, and the Soviet Union was dismantled in 1990. Unfortunately, right now, you have the exact opposite. You have 3 world leaders who simply don't get along with one another at all. You have Joe Biden, who is just incredibly old. I mean, it's really 3 old men, but Joe Biden is incredibly old. It's hard to think that if he wins the next election, he'll be serving from the age of 82 to 86. I mean, even by the standards of Helderberg Village, where I am today, that's considered old. And you have the chief executive officer of America at that age. You have Vladimir Putin, who's also an old man, not quite as old, is around about 70. And you have President Xi of China. And these 3 old guys don't really have any kind of relationship with one another. And they are the kind of leadership club of the world at the moment. So it makes one feel that it's not going to do that well. And, we're just going to have to wait for a new generation of world leaders, and possibly another country entering that kind of leadership club, like India may well join that club at some moment in time. And I have to say, one of the most important things when you're thinking of investing in a company is to look at the quality of the CEO of that particular company, because that CEO can make a huge difference in the fortunes of that company, because companies aren't democracies. That guy is the captain of the ship. I mean, in our case, Mark Cutifani, an Australian who served as our CEO until last year, was absolutely brilliant, and he basically rescued Anglo from a very difficult financial situation around the 2012, 2013, when we had so much debt on our balance sheet. He really turned us back into a major actor in the mining game. And so you have to consider the leadership flag when looking at the future of an organization, and of course looking at the world as a whole. The third flag I call the red flag of Russia, China, and North Korea. In the case of Russia, it's really at the moment all about the Crimean War. I wrote a book in 2015 called Flag Watching, in which I devoted 10 pages to the possibility of a Third World War coming out of the annexation of the Crimea by Russia in 2014, and yeah, that's exactly where we are at the moment. I mean, essentially, there are three scenarios to the war in Ukraine. The first one is basically a kind of standoff between the two sides. They just go on slogging each other's guts out, but nothing really moves, and the war just goes on and on and on. And I have to say that scenario has got a very high probability at the moment. There's absolutely no signs of either side, standing down in any way in terms of their demands. And it'll just mean the destruction of Ukraine. And of course, it's not such a sort of big news item as it was a year ago. It's a kind of war that's happening on the sidelines. But then the second scenario is that there's some kind of accident in the war, maybe a Russian attack on a NATO country or a Ukrainian attack on Moscow that kills people. I mean, that attack on the naval HQ in Crimea almost qualified as the kind of event that can trigger a world war. I mean, that's exactly what happened with the First and the Second World War. So you cannot discount that kind of scenario where, of course, the ending could be the exchange of nuclear weapons between Russia and America. The third scenario is the positive one, that people see sense and start negotiating over the future. And it is a scenario because certainly there's waning support for providing weapons for this war amongst the Republican ranks in America, and so it could eventually lead to discussions of how to end the war, and it would obviously involve Russia being allowed to keep some of the territory on the eastern side of Ukraine. I don't, at the moment, give a high probability to that scenario, but certainly if there are changes in the president, God forbid Donald Trump beats Joe Biden and gets back in, there could be negotiations over Ukraine with Russia. In fact, he's already stated that he would want to bring the war to an end very quickly. So you can't discount that scenario, but the highest probability at the moment is there's just an ongoing sort of slog between the Russians and the Ukrainians. The next country is China, and of course we now have the second largest economy in the world as a rival to America. America's rather like Britain was in the sort of 1890s. It was the sort of king of the world, and then it had to get used. Britain, you had to get used to not being, Great Britain anymore. And in a sense, America's at that moment in history too, where since the Second World War, it has really been the superpower. But China is right up there next door to it, and so there's a real rivalry between those two countries. And of course, there's the whole issue of Taiwan, which America has said if China ever invades Taiwan, they will send Americans. So it's different to Ukraine. They've actually said they'll send Americans to Taiwan to help protect the Taiwanese people. So that flag has to be watched incredibly closely. And then North Korea, obviously you have a leader who is totally problematic. I mean, there he shook hands with Donald Trump on sort of demilitarized zone between North and South Korea. But has there been any reduction in the nuclear weapons of North Korea? None at all, none at all. In fact, they've got back now to testing ballistic missiles all the time. They suspended a bit after the meeting with Trump, but they're back to trying to create missiles that can carry nuclear weapons right all the way to the coast of California. And so, yeah, this flag has to be watched carefully because it would change all the prospects in the Far East if North Korea resorts to any form of war with South Korea or with Japan or with anybody else. The next flag is very much in contrast to the cloudy flag of Russia and China. It's the gray flag of the aging of the world's population. I remember Pierre Wack saying to me in 1988, if there is ever a property crash in Japan, it will never grow economically again as fast as it's done in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, because then in those 3 decades, Japan was improving its economic growth virtually every year and averaging around 7 to 8% per annum. And so I said to Pierre, why do you think that? He said, because they're the oldest nation on earth. They have the highest percentage of people over 65 in the world. And he said, old people don't eat as much. They don't consume as much. They don't invent as much. Older nations start declining. And guess what? In 1990, the property market crashed in Japan, which wasn't unexpected since the Emperor's Palace before the crash was worth more than the entire state of California. And the stock market crashed. In fact, the stock market is still not at the value that it was in 1990. And Japan has grown ever since then at between 0.5% per annum. So it's an incredibly powerful flag looking at the demography of a country. And it's something that a lot of financial analysts simply don't do. And why is it so important? It's because Europe is following absolutely in the path of Japan. It's a really aging bunch of nations, and particularly Greece and Italy are getting old. And in fact, the Italian population is declining. The UK is the same. I mean, you just see the incredible pressure that national health is under, and you know how many millions of people are waiting to be seen in hospitals for routine operations, and it's all because the UK, Britain is getting older. By contrast, America is not. America is a younger, more resilient population because it has had a much higher degree of immigration than Europe or Britain. And that really reflects on the difference in economic growth between America, the UK, and Europe. I mean, America is sort of averaging around 3%. Obviously, there was the pandemic and it slowed down, but you know, the Americans hope for 3 to 4% growth per annum. Europe is sort of sitting in the kind of 1 to 2% range. Germany occasionally can grow a little faster than that. But just take the UK stock market. In December the 31st, 1999, the UK market, the FTSE 100, was 6,950. You know what it was this morning? 7,500. So it's gone up 650 points in 23 years. That's less than 10%. Meanwhile, America was 11,000 at the end of the last century. It's now 33,500. It's tripled in value. And I think one of the critical flags is the gray flag of aging. Now, why is it also important elsewhere? China is going through exactly the same. They had the one-child policy, and that created a kind of middle-aged population. They're throwing the house at trying to get young Chinese women to have more babies now, but they're not, because they've got used to working, and having kids in China has become quite costly. And so the Chinese population is actually declining. It declined 1 million people last year which isn't very much for 1.3 billion people. But it is a huge kind of signal that Chinese economic growth could be waning over the next 10 to 20 years. And guess what? India actually may overtake China to become a larger economy, and then overtake America to become the largest economy in the world. So this flag is very important. I have to stress that in South America and Africa, they're young continents, but it's not the only flag that contributes to high or low economic growth. There are others like good government. So you can have a young population with a lousy government, and then you have a very low rate of economic growth. The next flag is probably the most existential flag in our lifetimes, and that's the green flag of climate change. I remember writing a book with two of South Africa's most eminent environmentalists, Roy Siegfried and Brian Huntley, back in 1989. And in the book, they said, it's not going to be so much the general warming up of the world due to man-made carbon emissions. It's going to be the increasing frequency of incredibly intense weather events. And that's exactly what's happening now. I mean, we've just had a bit of an extreme weather event in the Western Cape, but it hasn't been anything like the kind of weather events in places like India, California, New Zealand, Australia, where they now talk of atmospheric rivers. Atmospheric rivers. It's because the world's warmer, it means that the clouds can hold more moisture. And then when they dump it like a river. And that's exactly what is happening in places around the world. But on the other end of the spectrum, you're getting extreme droughts, like in the center of Spain. A lot of Spanish farmers are in terrible trouble because of the drought in central Spain. California is a sort of crazy mixture of sort of atmospheric rivers and drought. And so we're going to have to get used to the idea of these very extreme weather conditions. And, you know, it's causing a huge amount of damage. I mean, there are places in the north part of the South Island of New Zealand and along the Gold Coast in Australia where you can't get insurance for your possessions or for your house because there's just too much and too frequent flooding. And that kind of thing is happening. You know, rich people buy houses very close to the sea and, you know, then they get flooded. And, you know, it means that there's going to be a huge change in lifestyle as a result of the green flag. And unfortunately, because of the three elderly men that we have running the world, the leadership flag, there is no real movement at all in terms of getting on top of climate emissions and reducing them. And indeed, Rishi Sunak has just pushed the date when, you know, new electric vehicles would be the only vehicles sold from 2030 to 2035. He's also just given the go-ahead for a new oil field called Rosebank, which is just west, I think, of the Shetland Islands, up north of Scotland. And so, you know, we're just not seeing the kind of energy around what is a very, very critical flag, because rising sea levels are starting to threaten islands like the Marshall Islands and Mauritius and other places. And of course, the melting ice and snow in places like the Arctic and Antarctic is creating huge changes in those particular environments. So it's a flag that has to be continually watched. The next flag is the anti-establishment flag, which really went up after the great financial crash of 2008. Because what has happened since then is that the super rich have got back to being super rich because the markets have recovered and property has recovered in particularly. And so, yeah, the super rich are even richer actually than they were in 2007, 2008. But the middle class, it's totally different. You know, there was a point made the other day that the average British nurse take-home pay today, in real terms, if you include the impact of inflation, it's less than what he or she earned in 2007. And there's lots of people like that. I mean, another crazy statistic is that 64% of Americans are living paycheck to paycheck. They don't have savings. And so this has created this anti-establishment flag, which in turn has created nationalism, populism. You've also got social media, you know, which is sort of making the flames even higher, and it's turned, you know, people into either one side or another. I mean, in America, I don't think I've ever seen such enmity between the sort of Republican far right and the Democratic far left. And people don't have a conversation anymore in the middle because, you know, they're watching these websites or these particular programs on social media, and the other side are watching the other ones. And they never talk to one another and debate the future. So it really is a kind of upsetting flag, the anti-establishment flag, and you've got to consider, you know, what this kind of turbulence can do to a country's economy. The next flag was an interesting one because it relates to a session that I did in 2012 with Interpol. I was flown to Paris, and I had the heads of police of virtually every country in the world at this session at a hotel in Paris. And we were looking at the biggest threats to the world for the remainder of the century. And you know what they named as the #1 threat? It wasn't a crime. It wasn't things like drugs or guns or things like that. It was porous borders. It was the idea that over the rest of the decade, there would be a huge surge in illegal immigrants trying to enter Europe from Africa and from Arab countries and into America from South America, and that the West had done nothing to try and resolve this particular situation. Well, boy, oh boy, is that happening today. You've got these small craft coming from France to the UK. They're setting up floating hotels, which are not that good. In fact, there was an epidemic recently in one of the floating hotels they had in the UK. They're sort of confiscating hotels from the public to put migrants in, which has caused a lot of public dissatisfaction in the UK. And of course, this issue is huge in America. In fact, one of the reasons that America could be heading for a shutdown, it never actually does it because they agree to a deal in the end, but one of the reasons given by the Republicans is that nothing is being done about the southern border to stop immigrants illegally coming into America. And nobody's got an answer for this. And of course, you know, with climate change causing other places to become uninhabitable, with the incredible sort of inequality of wealth between nations, which also has added to the anti-establishment flag, we have the situation now where you have far more people trying to get into the rich countries. And in 10 years' time, it could turn from hundreds of thousands of people into millions of people. I mean, you just have to look at how overwhelmed the Greek islands are, south of Greece, and the Italian islands. I mean, one island, the illegal immigrants outnumber the local population 10 to 1. So, you know, it is a huge flag. The debt flag is the 8th flag, and we all know that since 2008, there's been easy money in the world. So if you look at the national debt to GDP ratio of virtually any country on earth, it's gone through the roof. I mean, in America, it's more than 100% of GDP. In the UK, it's pretty much the same. And here in South Africa, we've now got 5 trillion rand of national debt. But the thing that's made the difference in America and the UK is that interest rates going from virtually zero for 5 to 10 years to around 5%, and of course you've got mortgages at 6%. So you've got to consider this flag. As I said, it could lead to another financial crash, and of course we had one American bank, Silicon Valley Bank, going belly up because the rising interest rates had devalued their US treasuries, which they were holding, and they hadn't sort of got any backup plan for that. And in the UK, when Liz Truss was in power briefly, the pension funds all got into a ridiculous financial situation because of a particular derivative related to the value of bonds. And as somebody said, the whole pension industry in the UK could have gone bust if the government hadn't changed very quickly, as it did. So we've got to watch the debt flag, and obviously at the moment, everybody's worried about inflation still persisting. I know that today apparently the inflation rate in Germany has come down a bit, and so yeah, there are kind of 2 scenarios being played, that actually interest rates now will stop increasing, and they will flatten out and then come down because inflation is under control. But there's another camp that says, well, it could go on longer than people think. So just got to weigh up the different scenarios around that particular flag. The pandemic flag is the 9th flag, and it's come and gone. It was probably the biggest thing that's happened to the world other than the 2 world wars. Almost complete shutdown of the global economy. There are variants around, but people are hoping that we don't have another shutdown. But of course, there's other viruses, particularly ones related to animal flu, which could suddenly become another threat to the world. We've had the pandemic flag on our radar screen, since the 1980s. Obviously, you can't tell when it's going to happen, but of course, as this current experience has shown, it can have a devastating effect on the global economy. The second last flag is the crowded space flag. The fact that it was about a year ago, a Chinese rocket nearly hit a satellite orbiting the Earth, and there would have been a colossal amount of debris which could have interfered with the international banking system, with the international communication system. And it really showed what kind of risk is being taken, because there are no laws of space. There's one UN resolution of 1967 which said space is free for everybody. But now, there's a lot of stuff in space. There are more people landing on the moon. Are they going to be allowed to mine the moon? What's going to happen next? And so the crowded space flag has to be borne in mind because it could have quite an impact on the future of the world. And the last one is the one everybody's talking about, the artificial intelligence flag. And of course, there are just so many different scenarios, positive and negative, that play out of the artificial intelligence flag, from, the fact that fake news can now be created just like that using artificial intelligence. People can write essays for school exams using artificial intelligence. It's possible to work out people's codes and passwords using artificial intelligence. But on the other side, it can enrich people's ability to create new things. So right now, it's such a new flag, nobody really knows what the real upsides and downsides are. But it certainly is the next technological revolution. So those flags create two general scenarios for the world, which we actually posed to George Bush in the letter we wrote in 2001. And essentially they are the same now. The first one is friendly planet, where the nations, the big nations in the world, actually get together to do something about climate change. And obviously the income inequality that exists in the world today. And, you know, solutions are found to the porous border flag of illegal immigrants. That is the positive scenario for the world, but it needs a new generation of leaders. There's no way the three leaders in the world at the moment are capable of doing the kind of things which are required for a friendly planet world. And the second scenario we wrote then, we call gilded cage. It's where the West retires into its cage and puts up as many bars as possible to stop illegal immigrants coming in and stop the rest of the world doing nasty things. And yeah, you have the gilded cage of the West, and then you have the rest of the world out there. And yeah, the West won't mind as long as they're not threatened. But it's not a nice world. It's a very divided world. And if you ask me, we must give a higher probability to the gilded cage world at the moment because of the lack of good leaders in the world. How long it's going to last, who knows? Because if you have different leaders, they can create different scenarios, just as Maggie Thatcher, Ronald Reagan, and Mikhail Gorbachev did in the late 1980s. What about South Africa's flags? Well, I have 5 flags from our conversations with South African companies. First one is very obvious, the crime and corruption flag, and whether we're making genuine attempts to bring it down the pole. And of course, a lot of people will say we haven't done that so far, but I think we're in a better situation than we were under the previous president. You know, with the Gupta family and all that kind of stuff. I don't think crime and corruption is as blatant as it was. And, you know, yes, we haven't seen people feeling the consequences of crime and corruption. But, you know, I think we are moving in a better direction. And obviously with crime, it's not just crime of the government, it's violent crime like murders and stuff like that. And that is still alarmingly high in South Africa. In fact, we head the kind of list of countries in the world in terms of violent crime. So it is a flag that we have to watch. The quality of infrastructure is the second flag in areas such as electricity supply, railways and ports, but most importantly, education and healthcare. We said in the mid-1980s when we did the high road and low road scenarios, the most important aspect of a winning nation is the quality of its education system. And yeah, it still is. And, you know, we have some of the best schools in the world in South Africa, but we have a lot of awful schools. So we have these pockets of excellence, and we're going to have to find a way of modeling the schools that we have, which are failing us at the moment, on the schools right now, and they're mainly private schools, which are doing an excellent job of educating the kids. And obviously, we're worried about the quality of university education as well. It would appear that as far as the electricity supply, railways and ports, there is a far greater attention to being given. But essentially, the biggest takeaway for the flag to become positive is that there is a proper alliance between the government and the private sector to bring these flags down the pole. Well, the red flags of infrastructure down the pole. You've got to have that sort of merging of skills between the private sector and government. The third flag is the entrepreneurship flag, where young entrepreneurs are given the right support systems to open up businesses and grow them, and where the township economies are integrated successfully into the mainstream economy of South Africa. You know, work has changed. In the last century, hundreds of thousands of jobs were created in big business because of the expansion of the mining industry. You know, the most important thing for a young person to do was to get a good set of qualifications at school and university, and then write out a CV and join a big business. Because, you know, those were the days when big businesses were creating all these jobs in South Africa. That's no longer true. Robotics have taken over. A lot of the big businesses have decentralized their workforces. The mining industry is no longer the giant that it was in the last century. And therefore, under any scenario, if you want to bring down our hideous unemployment rate, it's going to be because we give proper support to small businesses and entrepreneurs in this country. I did a debate with Julius Malema in February 2016 at the Cape Sun. It was put together by the Cape Chamber of Commerce. And I said to him, you know, I'm as much of an economic freedom fighter as you are, Julius. It's just that my definition of economic freedom is different to yours. You want to nationalize the banks and the land and the mines. I want to give genuine economic freedom to people to become entrepreneurs, because that is the only way we're going to create an economy that is growing faster, but equally make a real dent on our unemployment rate. And I know that a lot of micro businesses fail, but that's the whole part of the sort of trek that entrepreneurs take. It may be the second or the third business. And then where you do have successful businesses, as a guy called G.G. Alcock has shown in a lovely book called Casonomics. It means township economics. There are businesses in South Africa which have run for 10, 15 years, making 30 or 40,000 Rand a month, but they've never been given the opportunity to grow their businesses in other places in South Africa and overseas. So we need things like, I think, a kind of e-stock exchanges in all the major cities where entrepreneurs could crowdfund off the internet. We need banks to come up with a micro-lending institution which really works, because so often entrepreneurs say that they're not welcome in the banks. And of course, what the banks will say is that the costs related to giving a microloan exceed the interest that will be received on that microloan. Well, we've got to resolve the problem if we want to have a genuine entrepreneurial economy. And I think every big business in this country should be giving a percentage of its supply chain to trying to stimulate entrepreneurship. We did that in Anglo in the 1990s around our mines. We created a project called Zimeli, where we identified companies which could provide items underground. And yeah, it's been a very, very successful project. And we really need to do that now. The fourth flag is the very obvious one of the 2024 election. And, you know, it could be a very close result, particularly with the talk of coalitions between the parties. And if only the opposition parties would give a positive view of what they would do if they were a government. I mean, I wrote an article talking about how the DA should rebrand itself, because it spends its whole time taking swipes at the ANC and the EFF. And yes, the DA have run the most successful province in South Africa in terms of the government of that province. But what they've got to tell the young people in Soweto and elsewhere is, this is what we'll do for you if you give us your vote. Because there are a lot of swing voters at the moment out there. Recent surveys have shown this. but you're not going to get people to give you the vote unless you tell them what you're going to do for them. And we really need the minority parties, even if they're in coalition, to say, this is what we will do if we become the government of the country. It actually is, as was said in the introduction, a watershed election, the 2024 election. So, yeah, I'm waiting for the minority parties to articulate much better than they're doing at the moment what they would do to put this country on the economic high road. And the last flag is the neutrality flag. It came up with the whole incident around Lady Bar, the Lady R ship in Simonstown, and whether it was loaded with weapons or not, and it would appear that it was not loaded with weapons. But it showed how important it is to tread a neutral path in today's divided world. If you're living in the gilded cage world and you want to trade with America, trade with Europe, trade with China and everything else, it's a hard thing to do, but it is such an important flag for South Africa to have real growth in exports over the next 5 to 10 years. The last thing we need are the Americans or Chinese or some saying, we don't want your imports anymore because you're clearly on the other side. So the neutrality flag is a very important flag. And these 5 flags lead to 2 mainframe South African scenarios. The first one we call people's economy, which is where steps are taken to establish a genuine entrepreneurially driven economy, which grows from the ground upwards, while infrastructure and services are enhanced by a lasting government-private sector partnership. That is the people's economy scenario. It means a totally different change of attitude to what we've had. We did it politically, and we had that incredible period in the early 90s where we created a proper democracy. And with the election in 1994, we've now got to do it economically if we want to sort of stay on the high road scenario. We're at the economic crossroads as opposed to the political crossroads. And the second scenario is cautionary tale, where the economy flounders, where there's more protest action like there was during the pandemic in KwaZulu-Natal, in Gauteng, which caused an incredible amount of damages to shops and other property. Absolutely terrible. And however, it did show the good side of South Africa in terms of the incredible teamwork that was done to clean up the destruction that was created. But obviously, in a cautionary tale scenario, that those incidents occur more and more often. I mean, at the moment, there's the kind of incidents which are happening in Swellendam in the Western Cape, which are very, very distressing. You know, we've got to get on top of this situation because we could decline in that cautionary tale scenario into a wasteland. And, you know, one can't even rule out a kind of civil war. Now, I'm probably going to say something quite controversial because there are a lot of people who are very negative about South Africa at the moment. But I feel that because the private sector has been so resilient during the pandemic and during the load shedding, I still feel there's a 50-50 between the 2 scenarios. And that's why the election next year is just so critical for South Africa. And it really could be a tipping point either way. And I just really want, you know, people to campaign properly because I think there are lots of votes at the moment up for grabs. And the last thing we want is another election where there's, you know, a huge abstention from voting. This is a very, very critical election. So there you have it. I've given you the methodology, weighing up the flags, the driving forces, driving the present into the future, the clockwork ones ticking away, and the cloudy ones which can lead to different scenarios. Then obviously looking at those different possibilities, good and bad, and then obviously weighing up the probabilities between the two. I've given you the global flags, which came out of all the work that we've done with international clients. I mean, one of the last sessions we did was with the rulers of Dubai, and that was a very interesting session. And then I've given you the two scenarios, the friendly planet scenario, where we try and get back to a globalization and a kind of world team rather than the very divided world we live in. But given the leadership flag, the disappointing leadership flag, we have that second scenario of a gilded cage, which really will not resolve problems like climate change or anything else. And then I've given you the South African flags, and I've given you the two South African scenarios, people's economy versus cautionary tale, and how important this election is in terms of whether the probability of one or other scenario actually increases as a result of the election. So I wish you all the best. I wish Apex Private Wealth all the best in future. And I'll end with a benediction for all of you who've been listening to me. May the fox be with you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Clem. I think we'll look at the poll answers now. The results are actually quite telling based on what you said. The first poll, what do you anticipate for the 2024 elections? It came out pretty even. 47% saying above 50 and 53% saying below 50. And then for question number 2, those two scenarios that you painted now for South Africa, the people's economy, at 53% of people chose that, and 47% chose the cautionary tale, which, as you just mentioned, you put a 50-50 probability to that. It seems that that our clients are as well. The final question: who's winning the Rugby World Cup? Thankfully, 64%. South Africa. Maybe that's the green and gold flag that you can add. I wanted to ask you that something that you mentioned was the leadership flag, and with the South African election coming up next year, we're all reasonably familiar with Cyril, but I know there's a lot of kind of questions about what happens after him. Do you have any insight or views on South African leadership after Cyril?
No, funny enough, I'm just not a kind of expert on ANC affairs. I mean, obviously the logical choice is deputy president, but no, I mean, that's why I've written this whole thing about the opposition parties, because I think the ANC are beginning to see the light on how important the private sector is, because the country's been running out of money in the last few years, and we have a finance minister who really tells it like it is. But I just want another vision for South Africa to be put forward, and if the ANC is not going to put it forward, then the DA and the others must do that. And I have to say that I had a fairly angry response from the leader of the DA, John Steenhuisen, because he said we've got our 5 principles, but those 5 principles haven't been turned into kind of the kind of language that starts really getting into people's minds, and that's really what is going to happen leading up to the election, so that we can look at other leaders altogether who might replace Cyril. And obviously, there are people playing the doomsday scenario that the ANC will get less than 50%, and then they'll have to take on the EFF again to make it over 50%, and then Julius Malema will get a very senior role in the ANC, and that could happen. That could happen, but don't concentrate that on that as the way to attract people's votes. It won't attract any votes. Fear does not attract votes. Hope attracts votes, and that's why the whole campaign has to be different, and hopefully new leaders will emerge. But you're quite right to ask me that question, because as I said, in virtually any organization, whether it's a country, an NGO, a company, who is the leader? and what kind of caliber is that leader? And it's very important that investors do their homework. I think Warren Buffett probably does his homework on the leaders of the companies he's invested in for Berkshire Hathaway.
Yeah, I agree with you on that. If you don't know, what's coming next, it's difficult to have hope in, in the way forward. One of the flags.
I mean, yes, it's quite true. If you don't know what's going to happen next, you start losing hope. But the sort of plea I make to people is, if you want to create the people's economy scenario, you're going to have to roll up your own sleeves to increase the probability. It's not just listening to people like me. It's about, what are you going to do to help create that people's economy? Not just politicians, but banks, businesses. I even saw the mayor of Cape Town the other day to go through what Cape Town must do in order to integrate all the township economies that lie around Cape Town.
Yeah, I think there's a big untapped. I think there's a huge amount of population that is employed in the informal sector that we just don't have a good grip of what that entails. That could be the foundation for economic growth. That could be the exact thing we need.
Well, I have to say, G.G. Alcock actually reckons that if you include the informal sector, the national unemployment rate goes all the way down to around 15%. Now, I don't know whether that's correct or not, but there is already a huge amount of people making money by doing their particular thing on street corners and stuff like that, because they've got no other way other than obviously the government relief. They've got no other way to make money. So yeah, it's very important that we now recognize that sector.
Yes, yeah, I agree with that. There must be, nobody can live off that government grant. You can't feed yourself off that. So there must be a lot of informal sector employment happening so that people can get by.
Yep, absolutely.
One of the flags that I think is quite prevalent in our industry is the aging population, the grey flag. It's something that I've noticed a lot, even in the past 10 years, that people are living longer, which brings up kind of questions of, how do you make sure your money lasts your lifetime? You're also going to potentially live into your 90s, maybe 100. What does the quality of life look like then? And how long is your retirement? And potentially when you pass away, you leave money to your kids who are now 70. And is that really going to be helpful to them at that point?
No, well, that's a very, very good question. There's one guy in a session I was doing for a British Provident Fund said to me the other day, it's a race between poverty and death. for many British pensioners. And yeah, it is true. People are living longer. And you're quite right about that point, which relates not just to your own personal money, but to trusts as well. That, if you don't use that money now to help grandchildren with education or whatever is needed, you end up leaving it to your kids when they've retired. They don't know particularly what to do with it. So it's becoming an increasingly important question to ask yourself in terms of your wealth. What do I need to satisfy the rest of my life? But what should I really pass on right now to help the quality of life of my children and grandchildren, and in some cases, great-grandchildren. We have some people in this village who are over 100 years old with great-grandchildren.
I wanted to ask you something about climate change, that flag. I get the impression that a lot of Western countries are heavily pushing carbon neutral kind of agendas, but a lot of them are potentially doing it by their industry becoming services and tech and things like that are a lot easier to migrate to carbon neutral, and rather outsourcing the carbon production to China and India, and they can produce all of the materials they need and pump out all the carbon, and you on the other side get to kind of keep your hands clean. Are you thinking that there's actually an improvement or in the planet potentially moving to a lower carbon, or is it just shifting from one place to another?
Yeah, at the moment, I think there has been certainly a drop in the rate of growth of carbon emissions as a result of what people are doing in the world. But, you talk to any expert, they're still very worried that we're going to increase the temperatures above 1.5 degrees centigrade, above pre-industrial era levels, and that could lead to a real tipping point for the world. So is enough being done right now, even taking into account that, quite rightly, as you say, manufacturing businesses are moving to China and other places, and the West is moving into services. Certainly, it's nowhere near enough is being done, and it's really up to everybody to look at their own carbon footprints. I mean, some of the great climate change people, they have to be careful because their footprints are very high because they jet all around the world, telling people that you've got to reduce carbon emissions. Meanwhile, they've got a much higher personal footprint than ordinary people have. So, we just haven't come to terms with the enormity of this flag. And obviously, the one big thing I'm watching as a sub-flag is whether technology is going to change, which allows green technology to become cheaper than fossil fuels. At the moment, it's not. I mean, take an electric car. When you think of the kind of infrastructure that has to go with the electric car, where you have to, instead of filling stations, you're going to have all these charging stations around the country. And then, of course, the electricity's got to be created in a green way by wind or tidal movement and so forth and so on. We're talking enormous costs. And actually, lithium batteries, lithium as a metal is going up in price hugely. And so the cost of moving to electric vehicles at the moment is hideous. And I don't know how it's going to be done to create a situation where at a certain date in the 2030s all new vehicles are going to be electric vehicles, and you can only drive a petrol-driven vehicle if it's an old one manufactured before the date. And so we need new technologies. And the one that I'm watching most at the moment is fusion power, because there have been successful experiments in the United States using fusion power, where it's like the hydrogen bomb. You fuse hydrogen atoms rather than split them like uranium. And there's no radioactivity involved in apparently the fusion process. So it's much better environmentally. But everybody says there's another 10 to 15 years to go, and it's always been like that. It's always 10 to 15 years away. But it's just like artificial intelligence. You suddenly have this new technology coming on the scene, which goes wham, it changes the prospects for humanity. And we may see that over the next 10 to 15 years with technologies for green energy.
Yeah, I hope so. We've got two questions from the Q&A. The first one from Dudley: how do we get the disenchanted voters to the point of wanting to vote in 2024?
Yeah, well, you get them to vote by giving them hope. And you give them hope by saying, and I know that a lot of people say, oh no, but politicians will always come up with sort of corny solutions. But I don't think it's like that at all. I really think, there've been a lot of startling successes for example, in the Western Cape. And these have got to be broken down into a kind of formula that becomes popular, like a sort of hit record. You put it out there, you get it onto social media, you get it onto Facebook, TikTok, and da-da-da-da. And in other words, you have a few phrases which you put out there about if you elect us, this is what we'll do. That's the way you get people to say, oh no, I'm not going to vote. My parents voted for the ANC, but I don't have the same faith, so I'm just not going to vote. If you want them to switch their vote, you've got to offer them an alternative vision of the future, and you've got to do it in a really persuasive way. and that's what I really wish. And particularly around this point about entrepreneurship and small business, and the fact that South Africa actually has incredibly talented entrepreneurs. I mean, look at it. The richest person in the world right now came from Pretoria Boys High. I mean, how many schools in the world can boast that they produce the richest person in the world? Pretoria Boys High did, with Elon Musk. He's the richest guy in the world. He's made his money in America as opposed to South Africa. But it basically shows that there are a lot of potential Elon Musks sitting in South Africa. My favorite story is about a young black guy who was called Siyabulela, and he came for an interview with the Anglo Scholarship Committee. And when we asked him, what was he going to study, he said chemical engineering at UCT. And we said, why? And so he said, well, I started mixing explosives in my mother's kitchen in the Transkei when I was a young boy, and it was much to her she didn't particularly like that, but it then led me to say, could I make a rocket fuel, which is more energy intensive than the stuff NASA uses. And in his early teens, he did just that. He assembled a South African team. They built a rocket. He put in his fuel. He beat the South African amateur altitude record. And it came to the knowledge of NASA in the United States. And they said, why don't you enter it into our competition here? And he did, and he won that. He sent his fuel over to NASA, and they were so impressed by it that they've named a minor planet after him. I mean, how many people know that story about this young black guy, that he could produce this amazing thing? But that's what the newspapers should be doing, is looking at all these incredible entrepreneurs that we have, instead of just focusing on the ANC and the EFF and politicians and what they're arguing with each other. We just need those stories, because we have to change our model, because the future model is all about growing the entrepreneurs from within.
Okay, another question from Barry. What about the civil service in SA? Is that a flag to be watched?
Yeah, obviously, a lot of very critical skills have been lost in the civil service, just as like there are a lot of critical skills have been lost in Eskom and Transnet and other places, and we've all seen the results of that. So in the end, the real flag to watch is around, whether merit-based selection is going to be used in future as opposed to cadre deployment. And if there is one really good example of that, it was in one of the questions that you asked. It's the South African rugby team. It's gone from an all-white team to a totally non-racial team, and it's still the world champions. And the reason we're the world champions is because we had a kind of supply line of clubs and schools and everything else that produced players other than white who were really good and who get selected on merit. And that's why education is the #1 characteristic of a winning nation. And so, yeah, if the civil service is to get better, then one of the really big principles is that people should be selected on merit.
Yes, yeah. A lot of the flags that you mentioned are things that, if education is done right from the beginning, sorts out a lot of problems later on.
Yeah.
Okay, there's a question from Patrick. This question is about the ANC's National Democratic Revolution. EWC is part of this and obviously influences the minds of investors in SA and asset managers. Will they operationalize their espoused policy?
Look, as I said, we have this scenario, which is the downside scenario of the cautionary tale. And one of them would be exactly that, because the National Democratic Revolution is just a sort of old-fashioned socialist revolution, which, I always say to people, it's why China has become the second largest economy. They dumped that idea. I mean, when I went and did this job at the Central Party School in 2006, very few foreigners visited the school. In fact, apparently, since it was formed in the 30s or 40s, only 3 foreigners had visited the school before I did, one of them being the chairman of BP to talk about oil. So they were very keen to show me around the school afterwards. And I noticed in classrooms, there were quotes on the wall. And I said, who are the quotes? Because they were all in Chinese. That's Deng Xiaoping. So I said, really? Not Mao Zedong? And one of the professors said, no. Deng Xiaoping came in 1978, and he said 2 things. Firstly, we must improve the infrastructure of this country, the quality of our ports, the quality of our roads, all the things to do with infrastructure in this road. And he said the second thing we've got to do is allow ordinary Chinese people to create wealth themselves. And he said those 2 kind of critical elements of the formula turned us from the 100th ranked economy in the world in 1978 to the 5th largest economy today, and now the 2nd largest economy today. So basically, China dumped the principles of the National Democratic Revolution. Russia didn't. And Russia today is a fairly small economy. And Venezuela didn't. That's why the Venezuelan economy is in trouble. It doesn't work. I mean, I say to people, why is America the most powerful nation on earth? It's not because of its politicians. It's not because of Abraham Lincoln and George Washington. It's because of their entrepreneurs. It's because of Henry Ford, who produced the first mass assembly vehicle. It's because of Walt Disney producing the first cartoons. It's because of Bill Gates producing the first computer operating systems, and Steve Jobs, with the mobile device. I mean, the interesting thing about Steve Jobs is that he wasn't even American. His father was Iranian, and his mother was American, and he was given up for adoption to the Jobs family, and and he turned himself into a kind of superstar, and it was quite interesting. He visited a restaurant in Los Angeles run by his real father. He didn't know that this guy was his real father, and the guy who was his real father, said to everybody, "Oh God, we've got Steve Jobs in the restaurant," not knowing that Steve Jobs was his son, and it only came out just before he died, who his real father was. But that's what makes America great, is its entrepreneurs. And it's National Democratic Revolution, and most socialist ideas do not involve entrepreneurs. And that's why we've got to change the whole model on which our nation exists.
Yeah, and hopefully we're starting to see, maybe the electricity crisis has been the kind of catalyst to get that started, because we're starting to see a lot more public-private partnerships. Hopefully those continue and escalate, and we go from there, and move away from that cautionary tale scenario to the people's economy, which would be great for all of us.
Yeah, no, well, it would be, it's something that, as I said, it's why I give a 50-50, because unbelievably during that pandemic, places like Pick and Pay and Checkers, and they all continued, and all the restaurants continued. And, where I live, a lot of the restaurants have black teams. It was brilliant. Black teams that kept the restaurants going. So the private sector shows that if you give people certain objectives, they can behave brilliantly as a team. And that's why we've just got to change our whole model, because it worked during the pandemic, and it certainly worked during load shedding that we've had incredible adaptation by the private sector in order to continue to produce the goods and the services. And I have to say that, they really must open up the production of electricity to the private sector, because that's the way that we're going to resolve the shortage problem. But I come back to my point about Sia Zuza, this young black guy that I talked about. It's just that the media doesn't actually emphasize how incredible the private sector has been. The death of Raymond Ackerman, I have to say, they did give him, praise, and due praise, and it was widely spread, because he was absolutely brilliant. But it was for a day, 24 hours, 48 hours, and then they go back to all the other stories. And I'm just getting so fed up that, we don't actually identify those people who are really changing our country in the service industry and in the and also in the manufacturing industry. And there's some very young people. I mean, I'm just trying to remember his name. There's a young guy who's 18 or 19 who's become a huge name in America in a particular program that is aimed at young people and what they're thinking about, what they want to do. But nobody's talked about this guy in South Africa, and he's making it like Elon Musk in America. And there's a Chinese doctor in California who's made an incredible amount of money with his health businesses in California. And the more we put an emphasis on the socialist type of model, the more of those entrepreneurs then move overseas and make a killing in other countries. Whereas if the government had been absolutely 100% behind them here, they would have stayed. I personally think Cyril should do exactly what he did during the pandemic, but not with doctors surrounding him, talking, and then talking on TV, once a month. He should actually have a circle of genuine entrepreneurs around him, and they give him the 5 best things to do to create an entrepreneurship economy. And then he talks about it regularly on television. That would, for me, show true leadership in terms of, creating this type of economy.
Yeah, that would, if we aren't hearing these positive stories enough, it's maybe up to us to talk about them and to tell everyone about them.
Yeah.
So thank you, Clem. Thank you. I really appreciate you speaking to us and our clients. I also want to thank everyone who logged in and joined the presentation. There is a recording, and we will be sending that out afterwards. And also stay online afterwards. There's 1 or 2 short survey questions, and we'd love to get your feedback. Thanks again, Clem, and that's it.
Well, thanks, and thanks to Apex Private Wealth. That I'm feeling quite easy in terms of that earlier question we asked about wealth. And as I said at the end of my presentation, for everybody who listened, may the fox be with you. Thank you.